Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chipwood. This is Randy Schietzelt, and I'm Nancy Schietzelt. And Chipwood was originally the property of Bill and Ardith Wingate, who lived here for 40-some years. And they began the process of naturalizing this property from what used to be a farm. And we have lived here the last 20 years and have continued that process to the point where we now have more than 300 plant species here, some native, some non-native. And Bill and Ardith protected the property into perpetuity by placing a conservation easement on the property, which is held by the Land Conservancy of McHenry County. And we have subsequently had it certified as a bird and butterfly sanctuary by the Illinois Audubon Society. We were going to welcome you on April 26th to a real yard walk hosted by the Wildflower Propagation and Preservation Committee, but due to the coronavirus, that was canceled. So we invite you to enjoy the flowers in our yard today on a virtual yard walk. Randy will be your tour guide, and I'll probably chip in too.
Well, I can mention that you can see there's a stump here. We had a large oak tree that died. And you can see we got a little cage with the little oak tree next to it. One thing we would like to stress is you see lots of people with big oak trees, and frequently they just have plain yard underneath it. It's nice if you think about the future. That is, big oak trees, many of these started right after the Civil War, and they're getting to the point where they're about to the end of their normal lifespan. So it's very important to get some things going. Light levels are a big deal with oak trees. This was a white oak that died here. We got a white oak growing. White oaks need lots of sunlight, and we think maybe there's enough sunlight here. We'll point out some other oaks that we've tried on the property that will work better with lower light levels. Right here is the old septic tank from the old house that was present, and it was obviously messed up a bit. This was lawn when we moved in here, and we have moved it back. If you notice, we have a border of stone to make it look like it's a garden. And we originally killed the lawn by putting down topsoil and then newspaper and then planting into it. And a number of things, like you can see the bellwort here, the flowers with the yellow flowers. And that's all expanding. So it's fairly expensive to buy a lot of plants, but if you get them going, they will expand over time. And in this case, then, we're starting to get a number of clumps. And this, as I said, when we built the house, was a complete mess, and now it's starting to look like fairly decent habitat. And we do have a little native bee flying around here, but it doesn't look like he's going to sit still for anybody videoing this.
In addition to the plants that Randy has already mentioned, we have the taller plants coming up back here. We'll show you greater or larger patches of these plants in other places on the property. We did not plant the black cohosh here. Those are the taller plants. But again, they migrated here, and they are an example of one of the plants that is doing so well on our property. It's always fun each year to notice, and those of you who have native landscaping are probably aware of this, but it's always fun each year to notice that the winter weather and summer rains and so forth will have an influence on what plants do the best in your yard that spring. And sometimes, for instance, this year happens to be a really good bloodwort year. Sometimes it's not. Really good black cohosh year. Sometimes it's not. Here also we have rue anemones that have been spreading as well. We have some celandine poppy in here, although you're going to see much better celandine poppies in other places. So I'll hand it back to Randy.
Okay, here you can see we obviously have quite a patch of Mayapples. And as we said, this was lawn. We stopped mowing it, and a few of these came up, and they've been expanding. And here we have our nice border, and you can see they're expanding beyond. You may notice we haven't mowed right here yet, and we usually don't mow this part until June, because we have shooting stars, we have trillium, we have all sorts of nice plants that come in here. We do have friends that have come over here and make people real happy, allow people to dig and get some plants. But at any rate, the Mayapples will spread, and many of you will know when you get two leaves, and in between there's a little flower bud coming up. If it's a single, then that's the one that's not going to bloom. But obviously very happy and expanding and getting bigger and bigger. And as we said, this was all grass and transplanted some things in there. The nice thing is when you have time that you live in a place for a while, when you plant some of this stuff and let it go and keep the invasives out, it goes and it fills in. And once again, we planted a few shooting stars into here. This is where a lot of construction happened, so this was all messed up at one point. And, you know, these over time will expand and fill in. Okay, we do tend to have a moist yard here. A few other plants of note. We do have Jacob's Ladder here, which is a nice native, some dwarf larkspur, and twin leaf. And you may notice there's some little ones of each moving around. We just noticed some Jacob's Ladder moved out into the yard, and we've even sometimes get it in other parts of the property. When you get wildlife using your property, they help you out by moving things around. And it's always interesting how everything moves. You think that you plant it one way and somewhere, and that's where it's going to stay. And next thing you know, it's somewhere else. And here we have quite a patch of spring beauties. Once again, when this was lawn, there was hardly any of these here. We had somebody ask for some right when we first moved in. I remember thinking, ooh, we don't have very many, and I don't know if we ought to be giving them away. Well, you can see, obviously, they've expanded quite a bit. And this is one plant that does work well when you have an area that gets mowed. This area gets mowed during most of the summer, and the spring beauties are fine with that. You can find, like, old cemeteries where spring beauties are doing just fine, and it does get mowed during the summer months. So that's a wildflower that seems to be pretty tough, and it's doing just fine here and going gangbusters. And usually a feature everybody likes is this stream that's been coming through the property. When we bought the place, they were wanting to call this a ditch because in the summer it was dry. Past couple of years, though, we've had so much water coming down, so much rain, it's pretty much been a permanent stream. And it is an awfully nice feature to have, although you can tell by where the posts are in the stream that it's gotten wider, and it actually has had more water recently. It used to be a much narrower situation. Okay, I'd like to point out here we have a nice expanding patch of trout lily. There's one here that the bloom isn't quite open yet. When we bought the place, there was a big patch of trout lily here, and I really liked it. And one day, my dad was here watching the construction people. My dad went off to lunch, and they came through here with some bobcat and put their blade down and took them all off. I remember being very aggravated with them, and they didn't have a good reason for why they did that, but it is coming back. So I've been happy with that. A plant of note that some of you might like to use in your yard is wild ginger. If you notice along the base of the house how it's forming a nice ground cover, and wild ginger does make a really good ground cover. Now it does seem to move around a little bit, but it forms those nice dense stands. We should at some point find a flower. The flowers are these nice little red flowers that lay on the ground. They're pollinated by ants, and ants will move them around, and then they will expand by the roots. But at any rate, there may have been just a couple plants put in there that was all just soil and not a whole lot of topsoil. There's a lot of clay that went in there, and it's done spectacularly well. Oh, and we do have a nice little patch of cut leaf toothwort, and here we have the bloodroot and the little seed pod that's developing since they're done blooming by now. It's always a problem trying to time when you have a walk like this because different wildflowers come up at different times. And the bloodroot is always up first, and unfortunately lasts about a week. Okay, you may notice this shad bush here. I always try and pick foundation plantings that aren't going to overwhelm the house. But we have wire around it, and we have a number of plants in wire on the property because we do have a healthy deer population. It's not uncommon to see 8 of them walking through here. And once when we planted some oaks, we were getting tired. It was dusk. We decided, okay, let's put the cage around these tomorrow. Came out the next day, they had taken every bud off the oak. So it's good to do this to keep our furry friends from counteracting things, at least until they get to good size. Yeah, most wildflowers are adapted for coming up and growing fairly quickly in the spring. That is, the trees have not leafed out yet. The oaks basically are just in budding out now and forming very small leaves. There's a lot of sun. These plants will come up and typically have a very fast lifespan, and they produce seeds, and then once it becomes all shady here in the summer, they are good to go. They can become dormant until the next year. So in that regard, they're easy to deal with if you can wait for the time to mow.
Just wanted to point out one of my favorite flowers. I've got a lot of favorite flowers on our property, but this is one that I grew up with. It was wild in our native pasture where I grew up, and I think it's a sweet flower. It's woodland phlox, or as I prefer to call it, sweet Williams. And we've got a few patches of that around the property, and it's just starting to bloom.
This has always been a white oak woods. We're not sure how much of an understory maintained here. There had been a farm historically on this site, so I assume this may have been grazed. I assume this may have had some logging in here. But at any rate, we have a lot of Virginia bluebells, and over here we have a lot of celandine poppy. Pretty sure Bill Wingate planted the celandine poppy because that's not known from McHenry County natively. It is planted. But at any rate, they're both very nice plants. They both attract tons of insects. The celandine poppy is kind of interesting. If you know the Swink and Wilhelm index, that's a 10. That's one of the highest conservative species, high quality. Not known from the county, but it also works really well in yards because they bloom for like a month. So therefore you get that bright yellow color and it lasts. It doesn't just go away right away. The bees love it. You get insects all over it looking for pollen. The bluebells, same thing. They get lots and lots of bugs gathering nectar and pollen from them. And you may notice we get kind of big sweeps of both the celandine poppy and the bluebells. It'd be nice if the bluebells lasted a little longer, but they are really, really pretty when this happens. All the neighbors will comment on how they like to see this. And we do have a jack-in-the-pulpit here. We do get some that get upwards of 3 feet tall, and apparently there is some genetic variant where they'll double their chromosome numbers and they will get bigger, but they really do like in moist woods like this. This woods tends to face to the north and stays fairly moist, and we get a lot of lush plant growth like that. And we should comment on these guys, a perennial favorite of everyone, the great white trillium. We have some around the property. I'm always worried we have so many deer that they're going to disappear, but apparently we have enough plants that they like other things, and they have not taken them out. They do expand a little bit. You may not see there's a few around here, but they don't tend to grow real fast, but they are super pretty and a really high quality native species. Yeah, this is not necessarily the most scenic thing, but traditionally there has been a compost area here, and there were no plants in here. And when we moved in and there was going to be construction around the house, I dug up plants and spread a few in here, and you can see that they've filled in pretty nicely. Once again, if you have time, things tend to go. Okay, we do have a lot of big oak trees on the property. And one thing you get is trees coming down sporadically. And it is nice where we can to leave them, because this ends up being really good for a lot of wildlife habitat. There are species like we've a number of times had Carolina wrens living here. White-throated sparrows are thrilled with this. We have kind of continued some of the wood piles that were here when we started. You get various comments whether people like them or not, but as far as wildlife habitat, they are just super. And it's a good way of dealing with too many branches that come down in various areas. It's a little early for looking at leaves on these, but this is a native bush most people are not terribly familiar with. It's called bladdernut, and it's considered a marker of very high-quality woods. They're a bit of a problem for people that want to propagate it, because it has to be vernalized twice. It has to go through 2 winters before it will break dormancy. And it's gotten going here, and you can see it will spread. Actually, we've had to cut a few out to keep the trail open. But it is a marker of high-quality habitat, and it does make a nice little copse of shrubs. So if you want native shrubs in your yard, this is a good one. And if you have decent, rich soils, it does seem to take off. It's hard to get going, and probably not the easiest to find it. But once you get it, it does seem to go.
What's that called?
Bladdernut. And can we find a seed around here somewhere? Here's one of the bladders.
Okay.
You can hear the seeds rattling around in there. Okay, one thing that is kind of a legacy on this property is there's a lot of species diversity. This tree right here is a pagoda dogwood. This one we added, it's a chestnut. It's not technically a native here, but it is a native species in the U.S., and it's a species that's had a hard time with the chestnut blight that took a lot of them out in the east. And it does seem to do well in this area. Once again, we've got it protected so the deer will leave it alone. But we have tried to figure out some other plants that will fill in spaces as trees come down. We've got a big oak here that came down. Had a big hickory here that came down. This, I believe, is a shingle oak, which supposedly is a tree that was common historically but was so valuable for the wood that you really don't find many of them anymore in our area. But at any rate, it seems to do a little better in areas where there's not as much sunlight. So a white oak here would be tough to get going. And we have some wild leeks. And once again, you can see they spread. So one advantage is you can put lots of clusters of plants around, and then when they spread, you get a lot of diversity. And that will attract lots of native insects and native animals.
I just wanted to add a comment in addition to what Randy said about our wood piles. You'll notice as we go along, we've got a lot of them. And again, some of them were here when we moved here, and we've been adding to them. But we find that they really have brought us some interesting animals. We had a fox that lived in a den near one when we first moved here. Now, the fox sadly has left because we have coyotes in the area now instead of foxes. But in our wood piles, we have woodchucks and, that have babies, and we get to see them out in the yard. They eat some of our native plants, but, everything's got to live. And we have opossums that live in them. We have one rabbit this year. We don't normally get very many rabbits because there seems to be a healthy population of red-tailed hawks in the area, and they seem to take out our rabbits. But also we have loads of squirrels on the property, of course, and chipmunks galore. And they enjoy living in these wood piles as well. You'll notice that we're standing under a large maple tree.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's blooming right now. It's kind of pretty if you look at the blooms on it. But maples create such a dense shade, and they reproduce so so easily, and they create so many seeds, and we ended up with, over time, we've ended up with so many baby maples in our yard that we decided, in order to allow oaks to reproduce and in order to keep our proliferation of native plants, that we actually now pull baby maples on our property, and we're very careful about where we let them grow now. Just wanted to mention that.
Well, you can see there's a huge amount of these wild geraniums on the ground, and we're a little early. This will all turn pink in a couple of weeks, and areas that now have the bluebells will have geraniums under it also, and it's nice that as the spring goes on you get this different changes of color. Now we will, since this is a woods and everything will leaf out, we do talk about the green wall that will hit sometime in June, where everything is pretty much green for the summer. But this time of year, it is quite pretty. This is one of those interesting conundrum plants. This is ostrich fern, which is a 10 on the Swink and Wilhelm index, which means it's a real high-quality plant. And everybody who plants them says the same thing. They're real aggressive, and they, take over. So why they don't seem to do well in most of our natural habitats, and they do really well in yards, is interesting. But at any rate, they come up here. They will spread by the roots, and, we've got quite a bunch of them. I'd say now it seems to be kind of in a stasis. They don't seem to be expanding that much, but it's interesting. I'm not sure what the story is with them growing so aggressively here and then not elsewhere.
But I do have to take this opportunity to tell a quick story here about one of the long-time members of the Wildfire Propagation and Preservation Committee, and that's Pearl Olson. Pearl, of course, was a good friend with the Wingates, and way back when we first moved here, she was walking through our yard with us, and when we got back to this corner over here, there were loads and loads and loads of the ferns, and as we walked through them, she says, I just like the way she said this, "Oh, you guys, these ferns are marching towards your house. You have to do something about them." So we do actually try to combat them a little bit because they get so big. If you're familiar with ostrich ferns, they get so big and tall that they shade out a lot of things. So we try to kind of control them a little bit.
Yeah, we have sprayed a little bit if you can hit just the fiddleheads coming up early in the spring if there's too many and it's causing trouble with diversity of other plants. Well, you can see we have this nice maple here that's broken off. It's got a little bit of the tree still growing. Was it 3-4 winters or summers ago, we had a little derecho type wind that came through, and way off about 50 feet in the distance is a huge oak tree that came down and took down 5 trees with it total, including this one here. So that oak tree came down and it knocked down another tree, and that one hit this one and knocked this over. We hired some tree guys to come out here, and the salesman said, "Oh yeah, no problem, we'll knock it down for you." And the workers came out here and said, "Whoa, we're not touching that." So since we got enough space, that's going to sit there until it decides to fall on its own. But at any rate, you can see there's a number of cages out there since we have a sunlight issue all of a sudden. So we are trying to get some more oaks growing up there. Once again, always important, get some oaks growing. If you wait until everything dies, then you're going to have nothing. Okay, why do we care about oaks? Well, oaks will have more species of caterpillars on them than any other species. If you want to have birds in your yard, if you want to have animals using it, if you want to have wildlife diversity, there's no better tree than oaks. It's also the tree that is adapted for this area as the climax species. So plant-wise, animal-wise, oaks are really good for developing everything and anything. Standing in a little bit of a depression here, guess I should probably get out of it, that previous owner, Bill Wingate, was convinced was a old pioneer Indian trail. And there used to be, I'm not sure if we can find it anymore, the rim from an old-fashioned wagon wheel, the metal part on the outside. And it's interesting, last year we got contacted by someone with the Historical Society looking for an old Indian council rock where they would all meet. And they thought it might be in our yard, and it isn't. They ended up finding it about, half a mile that way? And the thing is, if you follow this line on a map, it points at it. Okay, this is squirrel corn. It's a close relative of Dutchman's breeches that many of you will know. And we have quite a patch here that keeps expanding on us once again. And I don't know if we planted this or it came up on its own, but it's once again doing very well. And got a nice little mix of some sedges, which is Pennsylvania sedge. We have the celandine poppy coming up here, some bluebells, some ferns, the squirrel corn, and all that diversity does a nice job of keeping out the undesirable plants. Typically, we walk the property every spring to keep out things like garlic mustard and a few other things, and the diversity fills in. It's always good to have lots of plants because they will fill in and keep the undesirable things out. All this open area through here, kind of a sweeping arc, is the scenic septic field. And you're not allowed to have woody plants growing in there because it will mess up the septic field. But there's no reason you can't have nice herbaceous plants in here. And actually, when they were going to do this, I thought I'd be creative, and I got a sod cutter. And I went through here and took the sod cutter and rolled up all the soil here, and I was going to put it down when they were done. And then, with the vagaries of construction, they didn't get it done, the house, for 6 months. And all that kind of decomposed and fell apart, so it was no longer in rows. But I took that stuff and just kind of threw it around. And as you can see, the seed bank in there worked really well. So all of this then looks great. I mean, it was completely disturbed. Everything was dug up and threw that stuff down, and pretty much the same plants grade in and out of everything. Well, there are a bunch of non-native. Yeah, that's, I believe, narcissus. Yeah, that's planted by the previous owner. There's a bunch of bulb-type plants. And they look nice in the spring, but not exactly what the WPPC wants.
I like friendship gardens.
Uh-huh. Yeah, they're fine. We're not worried about them. You can see the great bark on this tree. It's a nice bur oak. This is probably 30 years old and getting pretty good size. Used to be a couple big cherries that were in the process of dying, and we were worried they were going to take this guy out. So we actually had those removed. But this guy has responded. It used to be growing this way, and now it's obviously filled out to where it's a normal-looking tree. And bur oaks need lots of sun, so this was a great spot to plant it. We do have one other bur oak on the property, but them, you better have a lot of sun for them to grow. And some of the original landscape design for this property was to use the principles of a guy named Jens Jensen. And one thing he always liked was having an east-west opening. And what that does is it creates different shadows during the day. So the view will constantly be changing. So if you come out here, it looks different all the time. And that big white pine was kind of placed there to be a focal point from both this angle and from the house. And my wife Nancy always says if that one ever dies and falls over, she's going to be really upset. And obviously you would be, because it's a great tree and it really is a focal point for the property. And this brings us up to our pine area. This was an area that had been a chicken house up until the 1940s. And It's got the worst soils by far on the property. Everywhere we were in the back, there's like 8 inches of topsoil. It's great if there's like a little buckthorn tree coming up, you can just grab it and pull it out of the ground. No herbicide, it's gone. Here, there's lots of clay. Also, we're on a bit of a hill, and it's very wet. At some times of the year, this will have groundwater virtually to the surface. So it's a bit interesting to plant. All the pine trees here were planted by the previous owner, Bill Wingate. Apparently he brought 5-gallon buckets of water out here to water all these, if you could imagine. But now they've gotten to be rather large trees. The white pines are doing particularly well. As we'll see on the inside, there's some Scotch pines that got all sorts of disease problems with them. Okay, obviously a very different habitat here. We have a number of Canada yews. You may notice there's a nice browse line here. The deer kind of love this in the wintertime. This is where they hide out when the weather's bad, and also anything below this level pretty much gets eaten. We do have a couple Japanese yews on the property. Deer don't like that. You can tell it's a Japanese yew because it's got leaves all the way to the ground. But Japanese yew is non-native. This is native, and it's like a 10 on Swink and Wilhelm. It's probably not really native to McHenry County, but it does make a nice filler tree. We were just talking about, I don't know if we almost have too much of them, creating too much shade, but it is awfully nice because we live on a busy road, and it certainly muffles the sound and the view. And here we have a number of ostrich ferns coming up. You may notice there's great white trilliums through here. They seem to do particularly well in the pines here with the acids. And at one time there were a number of Scotch pines planted. You may notice this one's dead. I guess pretty much everybody is running into that. If you got Scotch pines, there's something called a pine woods nematode. It's transferred by this longhorn beetle, and they're taking them out just like the emerald ash borer is taking out the ash trees. So gradually these are going away. We will point out, like behind you is a little oak tree. This one is a swamp white oak. As I mentioned, it tends to be fairly wet in this part of the property. The water comes up to near the surface, the groundwater. And as a net result, swamp white oak seems to be a good choice up here. That one will actually grow. Once again, the cages are to protect it from deer so they don't just munch everything off. Looks like they got one bud anyways, so they can be motivated in the wintertime. Okay, since we've been mentioning trouble with the Scotch pines dying off, we have found that in wet soils like this, hemlocks work well. Theoretically native to this area, probably not really McHenry County, but if you want to have pines in addition to some oaks, those do seem to work well. We've got a lot of black cohosh coming up here. It's something that you hear about for those people that are into herbal remedies. Actually been some rustling of those. Once again, we planted a couple here, and if you notice, they're really taking off on us. This is about as tall as it gets. So we've got some up by the house. We're having discussions whether that's a good idea to have plants this big right there. But it is a really nice native plant, and quite a nice patch here of great white trillium. And that's something that you start to get when they've been around for a while. If you notice, that probably started out as one plant, and over time then you will get the bulbs start to spread. And as I said, fortunately the deer have not been after it. Supposedly this is deer candy, and we've got bunches of deer that come through the yard. So actually I think they do like jewelweed almost a little more, but we'll see. Okay, here we have a really nice expanding patch of blue cohosh. Was just reading how blue cohosh is a nice marker for a high quality woods. It's a plant that you don't see necessarily that often, and it obviously is doing very well here if you've got a nice rich soil and expanding. I can actually see a bunch of little ones coming up. Every year I have been collecting some seed here that has been donated to the Land Conservancy in McHenry County and will be used to seed other woodlands around the county. And we started out with just a few here, and obviously now you can see there's a whole bunch. Once again, time and keeping the invasives out really, really works. And if you wish to move up with your camera...
As anyone who knows me probably knows, I'm into flowers big time, so I just wanted to point out and have Ken get a close-up of the flowers on the blue cohosh. They're unusual in that you don't see very many green flowers, and we think these are probably fertilized by insects, and they're very tiny as well. And then we'll come right up here, and we can see the tiny little jug-shaped flower of the wild ginger. And they, of course, are pollinated by ants. They're situated right on the ground, so the ants crawl into them.
We have had a bunch of these 9-bark on the property, and it has been a good bush. This has been a nice big hick one. If you notice, though, we are starting to get some kind of disease on it. And just this year, somehow a bunch of them have died. So I don't know if there's a normal lifespan to them, but it has been a nice native species. They do fill in a space nice and easy, and I've been very pleased with them until very recently. You can kind of see there's a lot of dead down below. And I'm not sure if something happened with this winter or they're just all of a sudden to a certain point. Okay, this white oak we put in about 10 years ago when we had a big tree fall down there in the back, and we got a lot of light here. So obviously this one has grown well. If you got the right light levels with oaks, they will grow well. And that's what we've been fooling around a lot with, is figuring out what kind of oak will grow well here. White oaks, state tree of Illinois. It's a great tree, but you got to have like 70% sunlight during the day. Okay. This waterfall was a natural waterfall. It has obviously been shorn up with some cement because some of the native features were actually eroding away, but that's historical. What's interesting, though, is the stream occasionally does dry up. And right here we do have springs. And in the wintertime, even when everything's frozen, there will be flowing water from the bottom pool down there out of the property. And this area is always loaded with animal tracks coming in for things to get a drink. Is that too quiet or too much noise? Okay. Other things of note, we got a bunch of these in here, which is prickly ash, which is not in the same family as ash. It's got all these rose-type thorns on it. This is the host plant for the giant swallowtail, and we have actually seen those on our property. It's a fairly uncommon, more southern species, but they do turn up here because of that. Yep. Yeah, this area here, there's lots of water to the surface. So we do have some skunk cabbage that's been growing. It has been expanding over time. We just counted, there's 19 of them now. I think at one point we had 4. So they're slowly expanding. There is a plant here called sweet Indian plantain, which you do find in some natural areas along streams, so it's a wet-adapted thing. And that is a really nice plant for attracting bugs in the summer. There are a lot of pollinators that will use that. And we also have some marsh marigolds growing in here. This area will have a lot of bergamot and Joe Pye weed that comes up in the summer. And if the conditions are just right, it can just be a pink blanket on here, and the butterflies will come in here en masse, so in the summer. So this can be a great spot for viewing those species. Okay. Sure.
you maybe have all heard at some point, if you are naturalizing your yard, to don't plant this because it might be problematic eventually, it might get aggressive, or do plant that because it's easy to control, that sort of thing. Well, we wanted something to plant out right out along the road, just to provide a bit of a barrier from that road noise that you hear. So we planted something called Golden Glow, or the other name for it is...
Green-headed coneflower.
Yeah, green-headed coneflower. And it's a very, very pretty plant, but oh my, is it aggressive. In fact, it started growing and moving into this fen area. So that's one that we do have to control here. You'll see a few of them spread throughout. Does make a nice barrier to the noise, though, once it gets tall.
Well, when we purchased the property, this was a wall of box elder trees, which... they grow up and ComEd comes through and whacks everything off, and they were just basically ugly. Gone through and taken all those down. This tree right here, which is full size, is an American plum. It gets nice blooms on it in the spring, and it's never been touched by ComEd. They don't worry about it. So that's a really good one if you've got power lines and you don't want to have to fight with ComEd or get your trees shaped up so they're looking really ugly. Another thing of note, we have a black walnut here, and look at all those trilliums growing under it. Black walnuts are well known for producing an allelopathic, a chemical that will prevent plants from growing, but obviously the wake robin or prairie trillium is a good choice under walnut. Might just mention two quick things here. Got a nice little native bumble-type bee there. This is a yellowwood, which is a state endangered tree in Illinois, although down in the Shawnee National Forest. We got one other one on the property. They do produce nice blooms. It grows just fine here. The one problem is it is close to the wires, and ComEd likes to cut on it. It is real interesting, though, when the guys show up and they're cutting on it and you tell them it's an endangered tree. Kind of takes them off their game when they want to be aggressive that we're going to cut everything. The other thing of note is we have these two nice walnuts that are about 120 years old. And you can see the wires go right through there. ComEd has agreed that they can stay, and they put some little sleeves on it to keep any issues from happening with it, but you have to be a little aggressive with them and say, hey, you're not taking our trees down. And this here is a fairly uncommon plant. It is a purple flowering raspberry, and you don't get raspberries to eat, but it does make these nice flowers on it. And it is a high-quality conservation species. And it is filled in a little bit of area here. Occasionally some people say it is aggressive. We haven't necessarily had problems with that. But it is a nice native bush that will fill in some space.
Thank you for joining us on this virtual tour today. We are very sad that the actual tour wasn't able to take place this year, but we urge you to watch your calendar for the waterfall for the Wildflower Propagation and Preservation Committee next spring, as we may be able to do a real tour and welcome you to our actual property at that time. So enjoy all the flowers at your property.